In my last video essay on the unintended consequences of the Protestant Reformation, I discussed, following the work of Brad Gregory, the idea of hyperfragmentation, the view according to which there are more and more religious forms splintering in our present time. In fact, they're splintering to such a degree that so many people today will speak of being not even religious, but simply spiritual, or not religious, but spiritual, or spiritual, but not religious. In this video essay, I want to pick up on one of those threads and trace what I hope will be a very interesting line. That thread will start with atheism, especially as it arises in the modern age, in the 19th century. And then I'm going to argue there will be an opening for a contemplative or mystical sublation or overcoming of atheism as a consequence of a particular argument put forward by atheism. And in the third and final part, I'm going to draw on the work of René Guénon, who was a perennial philosopher in his day, and who tried to set out a particular view according to which the intellectus, or a unitive faculty dominating what he thought was traditional cultures, has been supplanted by ratio, a conceptualizing faculty. And I'll try to tell you why I think this particular point he's making matters. But before I do so, let me offer a very brief autobiographical sketch. And I don't do so because it's especially unique, but rather because I hope it will show you the logical or dialectical progression that I think lots of seekers are taking today. I grew up in a customarily Christian household. So I think that's probably true for you as for some of you as well. That is, you grew up in some customary faith. When I got to high school, it became rather fashionable or cool to think that God was dead, and in turn to think that there was a uselessness or otiose nature of God. You might think of Laplanche, who said, "Of God, I have no need for that hypothesis." And so by the time I was in AP English, it was just a very cool thing to think that one was atheist. When I was in college and then in graduate school, however, it wasn't even cool. It's simply that the question of God did not arise. And I want to put that forward to you. That is, in modern culture, typically in a number of staid institutions through which we have passed, the question of God's existence simply does not arise. You could even say that God isn't so much useless on this understanding, but rather beside the point or totally forgotten. I carried on through classical philosophy, through Greek thought, after graduate school, since I believed that the good life, or eudaimonia, needed to be brought into focus. So it was a secularized conception of the good life, as was evident, say, in Socratic philosophy of the kind that I really believed in. And I started philosophizing with other people while we followed this line of thought. So hopefully you're following the narrative so far from customary belief to atheism to a worked out philosophical yet secular account of the good life. Then the next step occurs around 2014 when, as I have said, my eldest sister quite unexpectedly died. This led my wife and me in turn to open up to various religious and spiritual questions. The interior search began. I call this an existential opening. The questions started to turn back around, and the inquirer, that is, who's asking the question, was drawn directly into questioning. That led us into Christian mysticism for a time, and then I'm going to skip ahead a little bit through Zen and ultimately into Advaita Vedanta, which is now our home base. Now, what's interesting about this story, I think, is not only that perhaps you can see elements of your own life following a similar trajectory, but also the openness in that chapter of my life, the existential openness, the sense of no longer knowing, of not being certain, the sense that one's mind and one's heart have both been opened up. It's in that spirit that I hope you'll undertake this inquiry with me today, the spirit of open-mindedness and of open-heartedness. Preamble aside, let's dive into the argument. I'm going to be drawing on a work by the late theologian Michael Buckley called Denying and Disclosing God, the ambiguous progress of modern atheism. This is in fact a sequel, and as you can see, it's a fairly short work. This comes on the heels of an earlier work written in 1987 called At the Origins of Modern Atheism, work I've also read. This one, as you can see, is extremely large and dense and even geekier still. He writes this one first, as I just said, and this one ends up being given as a series of lectures. It's much more accessible and in certain respects, quite lovely. There's one essay in particular that I'll be trying to spell out over these first two parts of this video essay. The first one pertains to atheism in the 19th century. The second part has to do with what he terms contemplation. He's speaking in a Christian key, in which I will term instead mysticism, at least temporarily so. Let's turn to that first part. So we find in secular modernity a very strange option today. Very strange. Throughout the course of Western history, atheism has barely been thinkable. You find it in classical Greek philosophy, of course, sprinkled here and there throughout Epicurus's thoughts and throughout Democritus's thoughts, and in Lucretius and others. But the dominant tendency in the West has been theistic, typically, and of course, Judeo-Christian more specifically. And so this very strange option, which arises in the 19th century, is called modern atheism. The view according to which God does not exist, or so it is asserted and held to be so. Now, what was the argument made, or one argument, I should say, one argument that was made in the 19th century that propelled consent? It's brought out in Buckley's book, in particular in the chapter I have in mind. This is the idea that God is a human projection or a mental projection, that all there is to the divine is this human projection or conception. We find this most explicitly in the text by Feuerbach, and this is what I'm going to quote, though I won't spend a lot of time on it today. Here is Buckley's brief summary of Feuerbach in this particular essay from the text in hand. He states, somewhat speaking in Feuerbach's voice, "It was obvious to him, that is to Feuerbach, from both the nature of human awareness and the history of religion, even of the Judeo-Christian tradition, that human beings have tended essentially and inescapably to A, create the divine in their own image and according to their own needs, B, reduce transcendence to human managements, and C, this is very Feuerbachian, destroy human values in the name of religion as if one had to choose between the glory of God and the glory of humanity. And is not each of these a form of projection, and consequently, for Feuerbach, an estrangement of the human? So I'm not going to take a lot of time to unpack that, but it's sufficient for our purposes to say, let's just stick with the first and second remarks. First, to create the divine in our own image, in the image of the human. So if humans are good, God is great. If humans are finite, God is infinite. If humans rather are limited in cognitive and affective and volitional ways, then God is unlimited in these respects. You get the idea. Secondly, every time we think of transcendence, we reduce that conception to human ideas. There are other ways of playing out the divine as projection, but this is what we're getting from Feuerbach. And it's a very common idea that's going to pass into the 20th century, especially in the United States. Now, Freud, according to Buckley here, takes this and runs with it in order to tell a certain kind of concise story. And I'm just going to read that part. So he's going to, that is, Freud will read the history of religion in terms of a series of projections and simplifications. Belief, Buckley writes, can be followed in its history as a series of projections. First, in the humanization of nature, i.e. animism, through the projection of psychic forces into natural events and things. So there's animism. So this is this first stage, this pre-axial age stage of animated nature. Then, in a polytheism in which the gods withdraw from nature, and yet obviously are, on this account, humanized. And finally, in a monotheism where the gods of antiquity are condensed into one projected father figure. So what's happening here? There's this new idea according to which our human conceptions are starting to be draped over what it is that is appearing. And we're starting to think that God could just as well be as constructed, to use more contemporary language, as anything else. Therefore, God is simply a concept, and on this view, a fantasy. So atheism, on this understanding, is arguing that God, in his or her own right, does not exist, except insofar as it's a conceptual overlay, and as such is basically a fiction or a figment of the imagination. This is putting pressure on theology and in turn on our culture. So now we turn to the second part of my essay, and this is where I think it gets especially interesting, because I don't want to see this as the end of the story, and not because I don't want to see that way, but rather because I think it creates an opening. In fact, I'm arguing that this particular atheism as projection is actually going to be taken up in mysticism in the West, and I would say most explicitly in what's called Jnana Yoga, the path of knowledge, in the East. How is it taken up? How is it actually helpful to begin to deconstruct a certain projection of our conception of God? Buckley goes on a little bit later, stating, what has been somewhat neglected in much of the popular renditions of the contemplative life in all its forms, however, is the dialectical correction of concept and experience that the contemplative tradition, I would call mystical, insists upon. That God, capital G, always contradicts God, lowercase g, that the vectors of finite experience point beyond experience, that knowing must yield to unknowing, a knowing unknowing. Contemplative authors and mystical theology, at its finest, have insisted that human experience is always and everywhere a finite modification of a finite subject, no matter what its intensity and extension, and that if it does not point beyond itself, such an apotheosis of experience, a divination or conceptualization of experience, becomes idolatrous. And any claim to represent the divine adequately. Mysticism and contemplation are informed then by a radical self-transcendence, a self-transcendence that is the polar opposite of self-preoccupation and narcissism, a transcendence that insists upon God as mystery above conceptualization. And thus we have what he terms a purification from these projections, a negation of one's own concepts, and so on and so forth. So this is the second step in our dialectic. In this compressed dialectic that I'm offering today, atheism comes through and tells us that God's a projection. It's a human construct in contemporary parlance. But then mysticism, negative theology in particular, takes this point actually quite seriously. So seriously that it agrees. Yes, we agree in a certain regard. We agree that there are problems concerning the attempt for the finite mind to conceptualize what is in fact beyond conceptualization. But rather than stopping the inquiry there, and I'll get to this in the third part of this essay, that becomes the condition of possibility for an emptying out, as mystics would say, the condition of possibility of a purification of the belief that our finite mind, the conceptualizing power of the mind, can comprehend the divine source. Notice the twist. The atheist wants to say, God is and has always been a human construct. The mystic, the negative theologian, replies, that is a temptation. That is a commonplace. We can try to reduce what is beyond conception to that which is within conception. We take that possibility, that temptation, very seriously, so seriously that we actually develop ascetic practices that enable us, I'll come to this in the third part, to see, as it were, beyond the confines of the mind. So in the second part, we find what's typically called the incomprehensibility of God. Not the non-existence of God, but the incomprehensibility, or as one theologian calls it, the darkness of God. It's at this point that you start reading texts in which there's talk about mystery. You can think of the Tao Te Ching. The Tao that can be said is not the eternal Tao. The way that can be named is not the eternal way. That is, careful with your conceptions. What is going to follow in this beautiful text called the Tao Te Ching will be pointed to, but will have to be beyond the pointer. I think we can start to make out the heritage or fundamental importance of this mystical view by appealing to two concepts, two extraordinarily important concepts from the French perennial philosopher René Guénon. And this is the third part of my essay. Guénon says the following: the problem with Western-style modernity is that we have lost what he terms intellectus, more in a moment, and we have instead raised up ratio, or reason. We need both, intellectus and ratio, but we have been relying upon the hegemonic power of conceptualizing. What have we seemed to have lost? This is going to be a little bit hard to hear, so I want you to open up your ears or to open up your mind and your heart. And that is intellectus. I'm going to use a few translations or glosses. Intellectus means the intuitive, apprehensive faculty beyond subject-object duality, the immediate receptivity of what is. Zen calls it opening the Zen eye. Some traditions call it gnosis or apperception. There's a direct realization or a direct non-conceptual knowing. This is how God is, or the divinity is accessible. And this is why mystics, worth their salt, point inward. Inward is a metaphor, it is a concept, but that pointing inward is suggesting something that is deep within us and that is non-conceptual. And in this placeless place, divinity can be known, but not because of the finite mind, but rather because what is transcendent of the finite mind, but not transcendent of experiential, apperceptive understanding. That's the crux. Intellectus needs to be reintroduced and reunderstood. One reason why I'm offering a number of guided meditations is that they're in line with this intuitive, apperceptive, experiential faculty that is going beyond the bounds of conceptualizing with a finite mind, and therefore of projection. Let me end with a thought experiment. You might say, isn't that using thought or conception? Yes, but I want you to look beyond that to which it's pointing. So let's suppose you were to go into a perfect sensory deprivation tank. The water is at the perfect temperature. There is a perfect container so that there's no sound. It's perfectly dark so that there's no sight. So you're lying there naked in this salt water. The salt water is at such a perfect temperature and consistency that the skin boundary, the sense of touching, falls away. Now, let's suppose that you are an adept meditator. So we've already allowed for seeing to go offline, hearing to go offline, touching to go offline. Let's say tasting goes offline and smelling goes offline. There are no scents in the room. So sense perception has now been turned off temporarily. So you're an adept meditator. That means that you have learned how to, so to speak, turn off thinking and feeling, thinking and emoting, or thinking, emoting, and desiring. So now these are all turned off. So conceptualizing is now off. Now some might say, nothing remains. Not quite right. Not a thing remains. But you need to find out what it is that remains. What remains is not mere void. What remains is called by many names in different traditions, but it's not nothing. It is not a thing, but it is not nothing. Some call it God or divinity or the source. And some say that that is precisely the essence of life.